The sky over Kessum Station was on fire, and none of it made sense. Alien warships that had ruled this world for 3 generations were breaking formation in open panic. Their commanders screaming into comm channels that this could not be happening, that the numbers did not add up, that one dragon should never be able to do this. Down below, in the smoke and the falling debris, a single dragon tore through a fleet that outgunned her 1,000 to 1. She was small compared to the war-bred giants the Ascendancy usually rode into battle. One wing hung slightly crooked, the old scar tissue catching the firelight every time she banked through the smoke. She looked, if anything, like something that should have died a long time ago. And that was exactly the point. Because 6 years earlier, this same dragon had been left in a scrap pit to die, thrown away by an empire that decided she was worthless before she ever took her first breath. Today, she remembered every single name of every person who had made that decision, and she was not done yet. To understand how a rejected runt ended up burning down the sky over an alien empire, you have to go back to where it started, not with fire, but with silence, in the damp, humming dark beneath the breeding vaults of Kessum Station. This was a world humanity never chose to live on. Decades ago, the Ascendancy had conquered it, folding Earth's colonists into the lowest rung of a caste system built entirely around one terrifying technology: dragons. Not the dragons of old fairy tales, but living weapons, grown in incubation vaults, bonded through neural implants to elite Thran riders who used them to enforce absolute order. Humans were not considered worthy of that bond. Humans were considered too fragile, too emotional, too slow, good enough to scrub tunnels and haul rations, never good enough to sit anywhere near command of something so powerful. That was the official doctrine. It was also, as it turned out, completely wrong. Eli Marsh was 19 years old, and if you had passed him in the vault corridors, you would not have looked twice. He was quiet in a way that made people forget he was in the room. He worked maintenance in the breeding pits, cleaning incubation chambers that most workers refused to get close to, because Eli did something the others didn't. He talked to the dragons, not commands, not orders, just quiet, steady words, the kind you'd say to something that was scared and alone. The other laborers mocked him for it. The Thran overseers ignored him entirely, which suited Eli just fine, because being ignored was the only thing that had ever kept him safe. It hadn't always been that way. Eli had an older brother once, Marcus, reckless and loud, and impossible not to love, who believed humans deserved more than scrubbing floors for an empire that saw them as livestock. Marcus was executed years ago for unauthorized dragon contact, a charge that, on Kessum Station, meant nothing more than getting too close, caring too much. Eli had learned a lesson his brother never did. Survival meant staying small, staying quiet, staying invisible. He had built his whole life around that lesson. Until the night a hatchling came out wrong. She was undersized, one wing twisted from the moment she broke out of the shell, and by every rule of the breeding program, that made her a failure. Genetic waste. Standard procedure was simple and final. Incinerated before it drew resources it didn't deserve. Eli was on cleanup duty that night. He was supposed to walk past her like she was already gone. Instead, he found himself crouched at the edge of the incubation tray, looking into eyes that were watching him back with something far too aware for a creature only hours old. He didn't decide to save her. Not really. His hands moved before his mind caught up, wrapping her in a torn maintenance cloth, carrying her out through a service tunnel nobody bothered checking anymore. By the time he understood what he'd done, it was already too late to undo it. He had just broken the exact law that got his brother killed. And somewhere deep in the vaults behind him, a scanner that should have flagged her as defective within seconds had stayed completely, inexplicably silent. No one asked why. Not yet. Eli kept her alive for 11 days before he even gave her a name, because for 11 days he was too afraid to let himself believe she would survive the 12th. He built her a nest out of discarded insulation foam in a maintenance tunnel 3 levels below the vaults, a forgotten stretch of pipework that hadn't seen an inspection drone in years. He fed her from his own ration cuts, told himself the hunger was worth it, and every single night he told himself this would be the last night, that tomorrow he would do the smart thing and leave her somewhere the Ascendancy could find her quietly, quickly, before anyone connected the missing supplies to him. He never did it. On the 12th day, When she pressed her small scarred head against his palm and made a sound he could only describe as trust, he finally called her Ash, and a decision was made whether he wanted to admit it or not. What made Ash different revealed itself slowly, in small moments that Eli almost didn't notice because he wasn't looking for anything strange. He was just trying to keep her fed and hidden. She learned the rhythm of his footsteps before he ever spoke a word, going silent the instant she heard boots that weren't his. She began mimicking the shape of human speech within weeks. Not words exactly, but cadence, tone, the rise and fall of a question versus a command. Other runts, the ones Eli had heard about in hushed corridor rumors, never lived long enough to learn anything. They were caught, scanned, and destroyed within days. Ash was different. Ash was clever in a way that felt less like an animal adapting and more like someone paying very close attention. The first crack in Eli's careful secrecy came from someone he never expected to lose control of the situation to. Priya Anand had grown up 2 corridors over from him her whole life. Sharp-tongued and impossible to lie to, the kind of friend who noticed when you started disappearing during meal breaks and simply followed you until she found out why. She found Ash curled in the tunnel nest on a night Eli had gone to fetch water, and when he came back to find her crouched beside his dragon, instead of running to report him, his whole body went cold with a fear that had nothing to do with getting caught by the Ascendancy. It was a fear of being betrayed by someone who mattered. Priya didn't betray him. She looked up at him with an expression that was somewhere between furious and heartbroken and said only, "How long were you going to keep this from me?" That was the night Eli stopped carrying the secret alone, and the night the risk of discovery quietly doubled. While Eli built his hidden world beneath the vaults, another set of eyes had started paying attention above it. Warden Kessum ran inventory audits across the breeding sector with precision that unsettled even her own subordinates, and precision was exactly what caught the discrepancies Eli thought were too small to matter. A few missing ration packs here, an unexplained heat signature in an unused tunnel there, patterns that any laser officer would have dismissed as maintenance drift. Kessum dismissed nothing. What unsettled Eli's fellow laborers most, whenever her name came up, was not that she was cruel. By Thren's standards, she was almost restrained, but that she seemed to be hunting for something specific, not rule breakers in general, something narrower. She would linger at scanner logs from the failed hatchling's incubation night far longer than routine required, running the same data again and again as if she didn't trust what was telling her. No one understood why a warden with an entire sector to manage would fixate so intensely on one defective runt that had, according to every official record, already been destroyed. That was a second unanswered question sitting quietly beneath the surface of Kessum Station. And Eli had no idea yet that it was tangled directly around the creature sleeping in his tunnel. The first was simpler and colder. Why had the incubation scanner never flagged Ash as defective in the first place, the way it should have within seconds of her birth? The second was worse, because it meant someone in power was already circling closer than Eli understood. Kessum wasn't chasing a rule breaker. She was chasing a ghost, when she seemed to recognize, even though the file in front of her insisted it no longer existed. And every day that Eli kept Ash fed, hidden, and alive in that tunnel, he was inching closer to a discovery that would not just cost him everything. It would force an entire empire to confront a truth it had buried on purpose a long time ago. 3 months of secrecy has a way of teaching a person how loud their own heartbeat can get. And by the time winter cycle hit Kessum Station, Eli had learned to live inside that sound. Ash was no longer the fragile hatchling he'd carried out of the vault, wrapped in a maintenance cloth. She had grown fast, faster than any runt record Eli had ever heard whispered about in the corridors, her crooked wing filling out with muscle that shouldn't have developed on a creature the Ascendancy had written off as broken. She was still small compared to the war-bred dragons paraded above the station, but she moved like something built with intention, not accident. Every time Eli watched her stretch that bent wing against the tunnel wall, testing it, strengthening it without anyone teaching her how, a question settled deeper into his chest that he was too afraid to say out loud. What if she wasn't a failure at all? What if someone, somewhere, had decided she wasn't supposed to survive for a very different reason? Priya had become the second set of hands Eli desperately needed and never asked for out loud. She started rerouting ration counts during her own shifts, shaving discrepancies so small no auditor should have noticed, feeding the extra directly into the tunnel where Ash waited. She covered for Eli's absences during vault inspections, inventing reasons for his disappearances that were just believable enough to survive a board supervisor's glance. What she never stopped doing was worrying, and she said so plainly, more than once, sitting cross-legged near Ash's nest with her arms wrapped around her knees. "You know what happened to Marcus," she said one night, her voice low enough that it barely carried past the pipes. "You know exactly what they do to people who get caught doing exactly this." Eli didn't answer right away. He never had a good answer for that. All he had was a memory of his brother's face the last time he saw it, and the quiet, stubborn certainty that walking away from Ash now would make that memory mean nothing at all. The near miss came on a routine sweep day, the kind Eli had survived a dozen times before without incident. A maintenance drone, one of the automated units that mapped heat and structural integrity through the lower tunnels, drifted through Ash's corridor while Eli was 2 levels up hauling supply crates, powerless to stop it. He didn't find out until he came back down and saw the drone status light, blinking red near the tunnel mouth, hovering exactly where Ash should have been curled asleep. His stomach dropped through the floor. But when he rounded the corner, heart slamming, Ash wasn't there. She had moved herself silently into a narrow maintenance alcove barely large enough to hide her, tucked so tightly against the shadows that the drone scan had registered nothing but empty pipe. She hadn't been told to hide. She had decided to. Eli stood there staring at her for a long moment, the fear in his chest slowly curdling into something closer to awe, because no Runt was supposed to be that aware, that deliberate, that capable of outthinking Ascendancy hardware on instinct alone. Above the vaults, Ketsoro's investigation had stopped feeling like routine diligence and started feeling, to the officers under her, like obsession. She pulled archive incubation records that predated her own assignment to the sector, records most wardens never bothered accessing because they were sealed under old classification codes nobody remembered the reason for. She cross-referenced failed hatchling data against a program designation that appeared nowhere in current Ascendancy doctrine, a string of characters that seemed to make her pause every time it surfaced on her screen. Her subordinates noticed she had started requesting scanner logs, specifically from the night of Ashes, hatching over and over, comparing them against something in a file she kept locked to her own clearance alone. When a junior officer finally asked what she was looking for, Ketsoro gave an answer that unsettled him more than silence would have. "I'm not sure yet," she said. "But if I'm right, this station has been sitting on top of it for 6 years without knowing." What none of them understood yet, not Eli, not Priya, not even Ketsoro with all her careful digging, was that the answer to every unanswered question circling Ash had been buried on purpose, deep in a program the Ascendancy had shut down generations ago and never spoke of again. Ash hadn't slipped through the scanners by accident. She hadn't survived because of luck, or because Eli was clever enough to hide her. She had survived because some small, hidden piece of her design had been built to survive exactly this. And somewhere in that buried history was a truth about to surface that would change everything Eli thought he understood about the creature sleeping in his tunnel and about himself. The night everything changed started with an alarm Eli had never heard before, a deep pulsing tone that rattled to the tunnel pipes like something alive, and he knew before he even reached Ash's nest that the quiet life he'd built for her was over. He found her already awake, ears flattened, every muscle coiled tight, staring down the corridor toward the vault access shaft as if she could feel the danger coming before it arrived. Eli didn't wait to find out what triggered it. He scooped up what little he could carry, pressed his palm against Ash's flank the way he always did to calm her, and started moving deeper into the tunnel network, toward a maintenance junction he'd mapped months ago in case this exact moment ever came. He had hoped it never would. Hope he was learning fast. Counted for nothing on Kessum Station. They didn't get far before Priya found them, breathless, having sprinted 3 levels down the second she heard the alarm herself. Her face told Eli everything before she said a word. "They're doing a full sweep," she gasped. "Not routine. Full sweep?" Ketsoro ordered herself. "She's pulling teams off every other assignment." Eli felt the floor tilt beneath him. A full sweep meant scanners in every tunnel, drones in every alcove, nowhere left for Ash to fold herself into shadow and disappear. Priya grabbed his arm before he could spiral further. "There's an old drainage line 2 junctions west, past the last inspection point they ever bothered mapping. It's not on any current schematic. If you can get her there before the perimeter closes." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Both of them understood exactly how thin that chance was. They almost made it. Eli would replay those final 100 meters for the rest of his life. The sound of his own boots against the metal grating. Ash moving low and fast aside him with an instinct for silence that no 6-year-old creature should have possessed. Priya running interference 2 corridors over, deliberately tripping a maintenance alert to pull a drone off their path. It worked, right up until it didn't. A single scanner drone, one Priya's diversion hadn't accounted for, rounded the final junction just as Eli reached the drainage access hatch, its light sweeping across Ash's scarred wing before he could pull her into the shadow. The drone didn't fire. It didn't need to. It simply transmitted one clean burst of data straight back to command, and Eli understood with sinking clarity that the location of everything he had spent 6 years protecting had just been logged. Kessum arrived at the junction faster than should have been possible, which told Eli she hadn't been coordinating the sweep from some command center above. She had been down here, in the tunnels, close enough to respond to the alert herself. She came alone, no strike team behind her, no weapon drawn, which confused Eli more than it should have given the circumstances. She stopped several meters back, studying Ash with an expression Eli couldn't read. Something caught between disbelief and recognition, the look of someone confirming a theory they had desperately hoped would turn out wrong. 6 years, she said quietly, almost to herself. You kept her alive for 6 years. Eli said nothing, positioning himself instinctively between Kessum and Ash, bracing for whatever came next. What came next was not what he expected. Kessum lowered her comm unit, the one that could have summoned an entire strike team in seconds, and instead asked him a question that had nothing to do with regulation or punishment. Did she ever choose to obey you? Kessum asked. Or did she choose to stay? The distinction meant nothing to Eli in that moment, terrified and cornered as he was, but it clearly meant everything to Kessum, because she stepped closer and did something no warden on Kessum Station had ever been documented doing. She knelt down to Ash's eye level, unarmed, and waited. Ash didn't flinch away. She didn't attack. She simply watched, tense and alert, the way she watched everything, and after a long, unbearable silence, she lowered her head almost imperceptibly, not in submission, but in something closer to acknowledgement. Kessum exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding for 6 years herself. I need you to listen to me very carefully, she said, rising to her feet, and finally looking directly at Eli instead of the dragon beside him. Every runt before her was destroyed within a week, without exception, because Command was terrified of exactly what I'm looking at right now. She isn't a failure. She was never a failure. And if I don't get both of you out of this tunnel before the rest of the sweep team arrives, everything I've spent 3 months confirming is going to die down here with you. Eli's mind was still catching up to the fact that a Thren warden was offering to help him instead of arresting him, and the confusion must have shown on his face, because Kessum didn't wait for him to ask the obvious question. She simply started talking, fast and low, her eyes flicking constantly toward the junction behind her, where the rest of her sweep team could arrive at any moment. There was a program, she said, generations ago, before either of us was born. The Ascendancy tried breeding dragons capable of bonding to humans directly, not through neural implants, not through force command architecture, but through something closer to trust. It worked. That was the problem. A dragon that chooses its bond instead of being forced into one doesn't just obey the Ascendancy. It can refuse the Ascendancy. Command shut the program down within a single generation and executed every scientist who tried to argue it should continue. She paused, and something in her expression cracked open just slightly. My family built that program. I've spent my entire career pretending I didn't know that. The pieces slammed together in Eli's chest all at once, hard enough that he nearly forgot to breathe. Ash hadn't slipped past the incubation scanner by accident. She had been born with the exact genetic architecture the Ascendancy had spent generations trying to erase, a design so deeply buried in the breeding program's old code that even the officers running the vaults didn't know it still existed, waiting dormant in the gene bank until one hatchling expressed it by pure chance. That was why the scanner stayed silent the night she was born. It wasn't malfunctioning. It simply had no protocol for flagging something the Ascendancy had officially declared did not exist anymore. Eli looked down at Ash, who was watching Kessum with the same wary stillness she gave every stranger, and felt the ground shift beneath everything he thought he understood about the last 6 years of his life. He hadn't rescued a defective runt out of sentiment. He had accidentally raised the one thing the Ascendancy feared most. Priya arrived at the junction seconds later, skidding to a stop at the sight of Kessum standing calmly beside them instead of a strike team, and it took her a moment to find words. "What is happening right now?" she managed, and Eli realized he didn't have time to explain it properly, because Kessum was already moving, gesturing them urgently toward the drainage hatch Priya had originally mapped out for them. "The scan drone already transmitted her location," Kessum said, "which means Command knows exactly where this tunnel is. I can delay the response, reroute the alert as a false positive. Buy you perhaps 20 minutes, no more. After that, I lose the ability to protect any of you, because the moment my superiors confirm what's down here, this stops being my decision to make." Eli hesitated at the hatch, some old instinct refusing to trust an alien officer offering rescue after a lifetime of watching people like her destroy everyone he loved. Kessum seemed to understand the hesitation without needing it explained. "Your brother," she said quietly, "Marcus Marsh. I read his file 3 weeks ago while I was tracing the original Bond program's records. He wasn't executed for unauthorized contact. He was executed because he was getting close to finding exactly what I just told you. I am not doing this out of kindness, Eli. I am doing this because I refuse to let his death mean nothing twice." There wasn't time to process the weight of that. Not with the countdown Kessum had just handed them ticking in the back of Eli's mind, but it lodged itself somewhere deep and permanent. A truth about his brother he would carry into everything that followed. They moved fast after that, Kessum guiding them through service corridors she clearly knew better than anyone had a right to, feeding false coordinates into the sweep network as they went, buying distance one falsified data packet at a time. Ash stayed close to Eli the entire way, and he found himself watching her differently now, not as a fragile creature he'd carried out of the vault in a torn cloth, but as something the Ascendancy had spent generations being terrified of and had never managed to fully erase. As they reached the outer drainage tunnels, the artificial light thinning toward the edge of the station's lower ring, Kessum stopped abruptly, checking a handheld display with an expression that told Eli the 20 minutes had just run out early. "They've escalated the sweep to a full lockdown," she said, voice tight. "Someone above me already suspects what I've been protecting. If we don't move her somewhere the Ascendancy cannot reach in the next hour, they are not going to try capturing her again." She looked directly at Eli, and for the first time since they'd met in that tunnel, her composure slipped just enough to show the fear underneath it. They are going to make sure she never exists at all. The lockdown alarm changed pitch 3 times in the span of a single minute, and Eli had learned enough about Kessum Station systems over 6 years of quiet observation to know exactly what that meant. This wasn't a search anymore, it was a containment order, the kind reserved for threats the Ascendancy considered too dangerous to capture and too dangerous to leave alive. Kessum confirmed it, without needing to check her display again. "Full elimination directive," she said, her voice flat in the way people get when they're forcing themselves to stay calm. "They're not sending a retrieval team. They're sending everything." Priya's face went pale beside him, and even Ash seemed to sense a shift in urgency, her muscles coiling tighter, wings pressing flat against her sides, as if bracing for a fight she somehow already understood was coming. "Their only real option," Kessum explained as she led them through a service corridor toward the station's outer ring, "was the sky docks, an exposed, heavily patrolled launch platform that under any normal circumstances would be the single worst place to bring a fugitive dragon, but was also the only location on the entire station with enough open airspace for Ash to actually fly clear the lockdown perimeter. It's suicide," Priya said flatly, and Kessum didn't argue with her, which somehow made it worse. "It's also the only option left," she replied. Eli looked at Ash, who met his eyes with stillness that felt less like fear and more like trust, the same trust she'd shown the night he first wrapped her in that torn cloth. And he understood in that moment that whatever happened next, she was going to follow him into it without hesitation. That certainty terrified him more than any Ascendancy strike team ever could. They reached the sky docks just as the first patrol squadron rounded into view overhead, war-bred dragons with full-grown wingspans twice the size of Ash's, their Thren riders scanning the platform below with the kind of mechanical precision that came from implanted command bonds rather than instinct. Ketsuro stepped forward alone, putting herself directly in the squadron's path, transmitting override codes fast enough that Eli couldn't follow what she was saying, buying seconds that felt like hours. It wasn't enough. A junior rider broke formation, diving toward the platform with his dragon's jaw already open, and Eli felt his whole body go cold with the certainty that this was it, that after 6 years of hiding her successfully, he was about to watch Ash die in the open where everyone could see it. Ash didn't die. She moved first, faster than anything that size should have been able to move, twisting beneath the diving dragon strike and driving upward into an exposed flank with ferocity Eli had never seen from her, not once, not in 6 years of gentle nights in that tunnel. The war-bred dragon screamed and peeled away, its rider fighting to regain control through a neural bond that suddenly wasn't responding the way it should. And that was when the second larger truth of what Ash actually was revealed itself in front of everyone watching. Because as more riders converged, attempting to lock command overrides onto the way Thren Doctrine insisted would work on any dragon regardless of origin, nothing happened. Their bonds failed completely. Ash wasn't ignoring their commands. She was structurally, genetically incapable of receiving them at all, exactly the way the old buried program had intended. A dragon built not to be controlled, but to choose. The realization rippled to the attacking squadron in real time. Panic replacing precision as rider after rider discovered their strongest weapon meant nothing against something that simply refused to be dominated. Ketsuro used the chaos, pulling Eli and Priya back toward the platform edge, shouting something about a narrow window before reinforcements arrived in overwhelming numbers. But Eli barely heard her because he was watching us hold her ground against 3 war-bred dragons at once, not fighting with size or strength she didn't have, but with something the Ascendancy had spent generations trying to breed out of every weapon they ever built. The simple, unbreakable will protect the person who had never once tried to control her. In that moment, Eli finally understood what Ketsuro had been trying to tell him in the tunnel. Humanity's so-called weakness, the patience, the trust, the willingness to love something without demanding obedience in return, wasn't a flaw the Ascendancy could exploit. It was the exact thing their entire empire had been built to fear. The sky above Kessum Station had turned the color of an open wound, streaked orange and black with smoke from 3 burning patrol dragons, and in the middle of it all Ash hung in the air like something the Ascendancy had never actually built, because they hadn't, not really. They'd built her to be destroyed the moment she showed what she was. Instead, 6 years of quiet nights in a forgotten tunnel had made her into something else entirely, and now the empire that threw her away was learning exactly what that meant in real time. Eli watched on the platform edge, Priya gripping his arm hard enough to bruise, and understood with clarity that felt almost peaceful that everything from this point forward would only go one of 2 ways. The full weight of the Ascendancy's response arrived within minutes. A second squadron twice the size of the first, led by a rider whose neural markings Eli recognized even from a distance. The same officer who had signed off on Marcus's execution years ago, now bearing down on the sky docks with clear orders to finish what the first squadron couldn't. Something in Eli went very still and very cold at the sight of him. This was the moment, not revenge, not the satisfaction of watching that man burn, though some old wounded part of him wanted exactly that. This was a moment to decide whether 6 years of teaching Ash that trust mattered more than domination had actually meant something, or whether the first real test that would break the whole lesson apart. He didn't climb onto her back to fight. He climbed on to buy time. Ash understood the difference instantly, banking away from direct confrontation and driving hard toward the open tunnel network below, where hundreds of human laborers were already streaming out of the vault District Ketsuro had quietly warned during the chaos, funneling toward the underground escape routes Marcus had mapped years before he died for exactly this purpose. Eli finally understood, gripping tight to Ash's scarred back as the platform fell away beneath them, that his brother hadn't been reckless after all. He had simply been 6 years too early. The officer gave chase, screaming orders his own dragon barely obeyed anymore, until Ketsuro's squadron, the one she quietly turned during confusion, cut across his flight path and forced an impossible choice between pursuing Eli or protecting his own exposed flank. He chose himself. Eli didn't look back to see what became of him. He didn't need revenge. He needed his people to reach the tunnels alive, And for the first time in 6 years, that need outweighed every fear he'd carried since Marcus died. By the time the sky over Kessum Station finally quieted, the Ascendancy's grip on the Vault District had shattered completely. Not from an uprising or a war, but from one dragon who refused to be controlled, and one boy who never tried to control her in the first place. Ketsuro vanished before the cleanup forces arrived, taking the buried research files with her, leaving behind only a message for Eli relayed through Priya that the program was bigger than one dragon, that there were others like Ash Still Dormant and Old Gene Banks scattered across a dozen occupied worlds, and that she intended to find every single one before the Ascendancy did. She didn't say goodbye. She simply said it wasn't over, and Eli believed her. Dawn broke over the station a few hours later, thin gold light spilling across the Skydock's platform still scarred black from the fighting, and Eli stood at its edge watching thousands of human refugees stream to the open tunnels Marcus died trying to build. Priya stood beside him, quiet for once, and Ash settled at his other side, her crooked wing folded against her back, watching the same sunrise with an awareness that still, after everything, felt too knowing for a creature anyone had ever dared call worthless. Eli thought about the scanner that stayed silent the night she was born, about a program buried on purpose, about a brother who died for a truth he never got to see proven. He thought about 6 years of feeding a dying hatchling out of his own rations, certain the whole time that he was doing something small and quiet and insignificant. They built her to be thrown away. They just never asked what happens when something that's used to being thrown away decides to stay anyway.